Greetings, it's Adam with Errata Non Grata, and that distinctive sound, or these distinctive sounds, come from the iconic and infamous Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man. And the reason I'm showing this today is because we're going to go through the various Pac-Man games that were released to the Atari 8-bit consoles. There was also Miss Pac-Man released on the Atari Lynx, which I do have. I just haven't had the time to set up pointing a camera at that, as I didn't bring my tripod home with me today. But either way, happy Pac-Man Day, May 22nd. Pac-Man is now 45 years old, so in case you didn't feel old already, now you do. And by the time I get this all cut and edited together, mine may no longer be Pac-Man Day. But anyways, starting obviously with the most infamous one, and I mean, sure, I understand that Todd Fry, who created this, I think from what I read in Atari Inc. Business is Fun, this was his first game at Atari, and he just took the project on all by himself. Really, it seems like Atari should have had some better procedures in place to make sure that there was, I guess, some Q&A with that. I mean, still, for what the Atari 2600 could do, it was passable, but from all the research I've done, it's pretty obvious to me that this was part of what caused the industry crash in 83 and, well, really from the middle of 1982, as this came out on April 3rd, 1982. And then that summer, Atari was starting to lay people off from their arcade production, and then by the end of the year, they were already starting to post losses, and those losses just continued all the way into 1984. And then, of course, the rest of the industry kind of went with them. But as a kid, like, this is, as far as I can recall, this is the first time I had come across Pac-Man as a kid. I did not know it was an arcade game at first, and when I was 3 years old and this was the first time I played Pac-Man, I didn't think much of it. I didn't have anything to compare it to. I played it every now and then. When the little square popped up in the center there, I thought it was a waffle. I remember joking with my friend, it's like, oh, the waffle's on the screen, or something like that. And we would also waste time going up and down through the portal there, which I also didn't know was supposed to be on the sides. But this was not the only Pac-Man game that appeared on the 2600. In fact, there were a few other ones, and we're going to cover the other Atari platforms too, so let's check those out. Now, I should mention before we get too far along that I do own a few different Pac-Man arcade machines, including Miss Pac-Man. Actually, I have two iterations of Miss Pac-Man at my arcade in West Valley City, Utah. It's called Arcade Galactic. I have Pac-Man's 25th anniversary, which was an official arcade release by Namco. It included the original Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, and Galaga on it. But then I've had the original Miss Pac-Man for several years, but we had it upgraded with the turbo software, so Miss Pac-Man just moves faster. And then Namco Classic Collection Volume 2, which also has the original version of Pac-Man on it, plus this really cool version called Pac-Man Arrangement, which was like a 90s version of Pac-Man, but it's kind of a hidden gem because not a lot of people know about its existence. Then I also have Pac-Man Battle Royale, which was released in 2012, but I got my hands on a special software edition that was never released to the public. I traded my board for it, and so it's like the cabinet's the same as what you'd see everywhere else, but the software does play differently. But anyways, here is Miss Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, which you can see by all accounts was vastly superior to what they had released. Just the regular Pac-Man earlier in 1982. I don't know exactly when this hit the Atari 2600, but it says copyright 1982, so I just assume later in the year. But obviously it wasn't enough to undo the reputation and brand damage that the first Pac-Man had done to the company. And then, of course, later on there was E.T., which did some further damage. But if you're ever talking about the great crash of the 83-84 era, it really started in 1982. I found evidence that from trade magazines where Atari was already laying people off in the summer of 1982 because sales were down, and they were supposed to be way up because Pac-Man came out in April of 1982, but their reputation was quickly damaged by releases like Pac-Man, and of course the market was already just becoming saturated with a lot of clones and other things, and of course Atari was taking some people to court, like the Casey Munchkin thing. But either way, all that aside, Miss Pac-Man on the 2600 is actually a pretty respectable port, pretty good one for what the hardware can handle. It's too bad that this isn't what Pac-Man had been in the first place. Perhaps if it had, it would have spared Atari a lot of that damage, and who knows if it could have softened the impact of the crash. Don't know. But later on, there was Junior Pac-Man released to the console, which I know I have, but I cannot find it. I looked and looked and looked, but I can't find the cartridge. I don't know what happened to it, so misplaced it somewhere. But that was not the only Pac-Man to come out on Atari systems. Let's check it out on the Atari 8-bit computers / the 5200. Here's Pac-Man as released on the, I guess you'd say, the Atari 400 / 800. I do have the Atari 5200 version. I just don't have a 5200 that's been modded to be able to work with the modern capture hardware that I have. I need something that has like composite out. My XEGS has that, so it makes it easy. Where this is running from a cartridge. This isn't running from an SD card thing either. But this, if you wanted something that was more arcade-like, then that's where you wanted an Atari computer, or the Atari 5200. Now, the 5200, of course, when they first released this console, somebody made the idiotic decision of putting Super Breakout on there. I don't know where that came from, but that was another indication of just how dysfunctional things were at Atari for them to put a game that crappy as a pack-in title. It's like, that's really going to move units. A Super Breakout, when of course the ColecoVision had Donkey Kong. Now that did change at some point where Pac-Man did become the pack-in title, and so that's where it could be, it was a pack-in title for a system out there, and that'd be the 5200. But it just, I think because they didn't do that from the get-go is where it didn't help the 5200. Now, granted, the 5200 came out in like November 1982, and as I just mentioned, the crash, from every indication I could find, was that it was already happening at that point. But it's like Atari should have been making some smarter decisions to shorten the impact or lessen the impact of that. Now, one thing that is noticeable here in this capture is, I guess, from the flicker that happens with Pac-Man's mouth. It's weird that sometimes it shows up and sometimes it doesn't, but at least on the TV, it's always present there. But I'm pretty sure I played this version at a friend's house. He had an Atari 800 XL, and this, of course, was far more impressive than seeing what I'd seen on the 2600. Can't remember how much we played this, but I do remember playing this back in the day and just being impressed by the look and the sound and everything. It's like, wow, this is so much better. It was proof to me how much better the Atari 800 XL hardware was compared to the 2600. Granted, this didn't use any of the special extra features like extra RAM or graphics modes that the 800 XL had. I'm pretty sure this could run on an Atari 400 just the same. And of course, that's what the 5200, as far as I'm also aware, the only difference is in the controls. Although that is something that I should point out before I forget, is as I came back and started playing these games again, I hadn't played the 2600 version of Pac-Man in many, many, many years, probably decades. But just noticing that the control wasn't great on it either. It was just oftentimes difficult to make Pac-Man go down when you wanted him to go down. And of course, that would be an issue a little bit with the 5200 stick if it wasn't working the way you want it to work. Whereas playing this on the 8-bit computer hardware, you'd be using a CX40, which just would have been more responsive all around with that. But overall, the Atari 8-bit computers also got great port of this. They also got a port of Miss Pac-Man, so let's take a look at that. So this one was copyright 1983. I do not remember if I played this version at my friend's house back in the day, and can't remember when I got it either. And so, yeah, can't tell you what impressions were of Miss Pac-Man back in the day, aside from the 2600 version. And by the time I got a 7800, it was already like the late 90s and everything. And I'd actually pretty sure that I played Miss Pac-Man on my Atari Lynx before I played it on either the 7800 or the Atari 8-bit computers. But compared to the version of Pac-Man that we just saw, the graphics on this one are better. But one thing that I've noticed is that just the movement of Miss Pac-Man feels more sluggish compared to regular Pac-Man. And I mean, the sounds are relatively the same. I mean, there are some differences there, just like there are those subtle differences between the graphics, but just interesting that, to me, that regular Pac-Man controls better on the Atari 8-bit computers. But we'll have more Miss Pac-Man to show here, so I'm going to just kind of go off of this one on to the next. And that would be Miss Pac-Man on the Atari 7800 Pro system. Playing this on my Atari 7800 Plus, so I'm getting the proper 4x3, I guess. There, but yeah, I can't remember when I got this for my 7800, but I do remember being impressed by the port. Now, it is sad, given that there is a very interesting history and connection to Miss Pac-Man with the 7800, in that the guys who created the Atari 7800 hardware, General Computing Corporation, Steve Golson, and they're the same ones who created Crazy Otto, which is what became Miss Pac-Man. And so it's, I guess, just maybe a little bit sad that the 7800 hardware wasn't made to create an arcade-perfect port of Miss Pac-Man. Now, in a moment, I'll be putting on a creation by Pac-Man Plus, who did do a 320 resolution mode for Miss Pac-Man there, but this one uses the lower resolution, the 160 lines, and so that's where everything's a little chunkier. But as you can see, it compared to, or if we put it side by side to the Atari 8-bit version, then you can see the improvements there. The speed is also better, the control is better with the 7800 version, and so this just kind of went to show that the 7800 was the superior hardware there. But again, if it's like if I was there back in the day, I would have been saying like, hey, what can you guys do to give us a, put more power into the 320 resolution mode so that it could properly get Miss Pac-Man going without the need of scrolling or doing anything with the colors. But let's now take a look at those higher resolution modes. Okay, so from here on out, these are going to be homebrew releases as opposed to official releases of Pac-Man. All these are on the Atari 7800. There are a ton of hacks out there for the 2600, 5200/8-bit consoles, and even the 7800 of Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man and such. But Pac-Man Plus, who's now, I believe, doing a lot of work for Atari, he's the guy who's designed Tiger Heli. That's coming soon for the Atari 7800, did Bentley Bear's Crystal Quest. Amongst the games where he cut his teeth on the Atari 7800 hardware was in creating these 320 resolution modes or versions for the Atari 7800 of Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man. And so here's where you can see Pac-Man itself. There are some oddities in the choices he did with the maze, particularly those bumps that are just kind of offset from everything else. I'm not really sure why that was. And of course, one other oddity you'll notice, and I think this is just a limitation of the hardware. Don't know if there was any workaround, like if he had done it in pure assembly, if it would have worked differently. I don't know if he did this in assembly or C, what it was, but as you see that there's a black box around the ghosts and around Pac-Man and other objects like the fruit, and that I can't remember the precise stuff. I read stuff before about this kangaroo mode or whatever. But just one of the limitations of working in the 320 resolution mode and the limitation of the colors and such. And so to be able to get the 3 colors or the 2 colors going on with the ghosts and having them all be different colors or something like that is what caused that. And of course wasn't able to fit the entire maze on there, and so had to use the scrolling feature. Now, scrolling has long been, I guess you could say, a complaint in the Pac-Man universe, as we'll see in a moment with Junior Pac-Man. They're used scrolling, and Pac-Mania used scrolling, which was a 1987 arcade release. I think there was an NES version as well. But the problem with scrolling on any Pac-Man game is you can't see the entire playfield at once like you can on the original versions, and so that can make it a little bit of a pain when you've been going through the maze and let's say you missed one dot somewhere, which happens pretty frequently, unless I guess you're a pro Pac-Man player and you plan out your patterns and all that stuff. But for most of us who don't bother to do that, maybe we should, I don't know, then the scrolling can be a little bit of a problem there. But let's check out Miss Pac-Man up against this. I suppose you could say it's the same engine that was used with Pac-Man 320, as it's called, and Miss Pac-Man 320. And all these were released on a Pac-Man collection, I think it was, through Atari Age. I'm not sure if they still sell that or not, but also due to the limitations of working in these higher resolution modes, is while you get those better looking pixels, it does limit the color. And so it's like at least the 7800, one of its places where it had a really strong advantage was in color in the lower resolution modes, but not so much the higher resolution ones. But see, there's Miss Pac-Man. So instead of having the just the blue outlined things, which does fit with the original Pac-Man arcade better, you get the filled in boxes and such. But Miss Pac-Man herself does not have the pink bow. She has a blue bow. And so I guess you can maybe say some kind of 80s pastel style going on there, although it was more mid-80s when the pastels really seemed to become popular, as far as I remember. But still has the scrolling there. But still a great effort, I think, on Pac-Man Plus's part to bring that there. Again, it's just really too bad that the 7800 couldn't have been designed, or like since it got delayed 2 years, I've often wondered, it's like, you know, maybe if the Trammels had been willing to put a little bit more money into developing the hardware once they got all the stuff figured out between GCC and Warner Brothers, if they couldn't have added some extra horsepower under the hood so that you could have gotten maybe the 320 modes with the same color palette that was available with the 160 modes. I don't know. But let's check out one other cool thing from Pac-Man Plus. And here's Junior Pac-Man for the Atari 7800, and done by Pac-Man Plus in 2009. And as I mentioned, I know I have Junior Pac-Man around here somewhere. I want to say that the Junior Pac-Man game, they did vertical scrolling on that one, and so that was an impressive game for the 2600. But Junior Pac-Man was in development for the Atari 8-bit, as was Super Pac-Man, but they were never released. And of course, I don't know if Junior Pac-Man was ever on the docket of plans for an official 7800 release, but in playing this port here, it should have been. Like, if this had been released alongside Miss Pac-Man on the 7800 back in 87 or 86 or 88, whenever it was that Miss Pac-Man came out, it would have been a nice addition to the library. Would it have saved the 7800? No, not necessarily. But, it would have given some nice exposure for this version of Pac-Man that I don't know how well it's known out there, just because it was released in 1983, 84, in the middle of the crash, and there was a lot of games that, they were fine games, but they were just released really at the wrong time. And anything released in the 83, 84 era, with a few exceptions, I mean, stuff like Spy Hunter, obviously, is remembered well, and a few other things that came out those times. But there were a lot of games that just got overlooked, even though they were rad games. iRobot and Major Havoc and even Crystal Castles all came from that time period, but just never garnered the same amount of love and attention from certain collectors. But again, Junior Pac-Man does have that same problem that I mentioned previously, in that it has scrolling, and so not only is it scrolling, but the playfields are huge in this one, and so where you can clear a level on Pac-Man or Miss Pac-Man after a couple of minutes or so, it takes a lot longer, and it feels like it with Junior Pac-Man, just because it's like, oh man, I'm still going on this level, geez. But if you don't mind the challenge, especially when you have things like the objects, instead of fruit, there's things like tricycles and stuff that go bouncing along, they'll make the pellets get larger, and so when you go over them, you move slower in trying to eat those thicker ones. But the horizontal scrolling is very smooth. The control on this is fine. I'd say it controls very similarly to Miss Pac-Man on the 7800. I mean, just overall, this is a fantastic piece of work from Pac-Man Plus. And so again, if this had been released back in the day, it certainly would have made owning a 7800 a little bit better than it was. And it even had the cutscenes in it. Oftentimes with ports, those were complaints as to whether or not cutscenes were included in things like that. And so it was nice that he took that effort, or made that effort to put that stuff in there. But I don't have the time to go over all the different ports out there, but tell me which one is your favorite Pac-Man port, and whether that's on an Atari system. I mean, you can say which one's your favorite on the Atari systems, but then get into if there's a port on something like a Nintendo system or any other system that's your favorite out of the ports. Obviously, the arcade versions are always the best, and so that's what you should always go with if it's your first choice, or if it is a choice. But other than that, Atari squeezed a lot of juice out of the Pac-Man licenses they could. In fact, a lot of people thought it was a Pac-Man or an Atari-made game. But that's all we got for now. Happy Pac-Man Day!